Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Jeannie, for having me be a part of this. It's been a real pleasure to take part in this class. So we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. I want to talk a little bit about historical fiction, and particularly about Hilary Mantel, the British writer who's written these two marvelous books about Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell and the Protestant Reformation in England. So we're also going to watch a couple of film clips from the Wolf Hall series that was made by the BBC and then rebroadcast on PBS. So I think I'll show one clip before a little break, and then I have another one that we'll watch after the break. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the martyrs in the Protestant Reformation in England, at least. And I'll come back to those a little bit in the second half as well. And then at the very end, I think I'm going to bring my dad up to sort of recap and bring this thing to a close. So it should be a terrific evening. Thanks a lot for coming. So the idea that I want to kind of try to emphasize tonight is that historical fiction in some ways can offer a sort of different perspective on historical events. So with something like the Protestant Reformation, obviously we've been talking about just how complex it is and how it's sort of different in different settings. But my thesis basically is just going to be that fiction gives us a glimpse of a kind of inner perspective and inner life of what it was like to live through the period. And so I think in that sense it offers a kind of new light on what we've been learning about and what we've been studying. So a perfect kind of quote for that is from Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel's novel that we'll be talking about tonight. She has this line on page 55. She says, "Beneath every history, another history." The idea being, I think, for her that there's these kind of layers in any historical moment. And so whatever perspective we might take on it, there's going to be different perspectives or different ways that people experienced it, perhaps, in their own lives. So I'm starting here with a great critic, Isaiah Berlin. He was an Oxford Don, as he looks like an Oxford Don here, doesn't he? He has a famous essay called The Hedgehog and the Fox, where he talks about historical fiction, and particularly about Leo Tolstoy. Okay, so we all know Tolstoy is a great historical novelist, War and Peace especially. And what Isaiah Berlin said about Tolstoy is that he was kind of troubled by this difficulty of being a historical novelist. Berlin says he could not justify to himself the apparently arbitrary selection of material and the no less arbitrary distribution of emphasis to which all historical writing seemed to be doomed. So that was Tolstoy's difficulty, like what to emphasize in writing a historical novel. So the first quote I have two handouts tonight, by the way. The first one will have some of these quotations. Hopefully they've kind of been distributed. I think there were about 50 of them, so there might not be enough for everyone. But this is the first quote on your handout, and you might share with somebody if the person next to you doesn't have it. So this is Berlin, Isaiah Berlin again. "History as it is normally written usually represents political events, public events, as the most important, while spiritual, inner events are largely forgotten. Yet prima facie, it is the inner events, that are the most real, the most immediate experience of human beings." So according to Isaiah Berlin, no one was better than Tolstoy at doing this, at kind of presenting the inner events of a particular historical moment. He said that Tolstoy excelled at representing the texture and feel of history in a look, a thought, or a pang of sentiment. In short, the inner experience of history. And I think that's true of Hilary Mantel as well. I think in Hilary Mantel's novels, she kind of draws us into that kind of inner experience of what it was like to live through it. And she does this mainly in these novels, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, if you've read them. She does it through her protagonist, right, primarily, which is Thomas Cromwell. So she focalizes the narrative through Thomas Cromwell, her main protagonist. And this is a technique, not unlike what many writers do. It's a technique called third-person limited omniscient narration, where you have a narrator, right? But the narrator is kind of looking through the eyes of one of the characters, right? Henry James was amazing at this, and Henry James called that protagonist his central consciousness, because even though there was a narrator who was separate from that character, he wanted everything to be sort of filtered through the character, okay? So in Mantel's hands, this is the role that that Thomas Cromwell plays. He's her central consciousness, as it were. So the other thing I think that is a kind of a trick that historical novelists have to play on us is that we all know the outcomes sometimes in advance. If we've studied the period, we know, for example, that Thomas Cromwell eventually dies at the hands of Henry VIII, right? But the trick is to make it seem like, as we're reading the novel, that we don't know what's coming, right? So she has to kind of somehow create suspense even when readers already know the outcome and even when she knows the outcome. There was a review in the New Yorker magazine by this woman, Larissa McFarquhar, and it was about the second novel, I believe, Bring Up the Bodies. And so anyway, in the second quote, I have a quote from Larissa that talks about this. She says, when she is writing historical fiction, she knows what will happen and could do nothing about it. But she must try to imagine the events as if the outcome were not yet fixed from the perspective of the characters who are moving forward in ignorance. This is not just an emotional business of entering the character's point of view. It is also a matter of remembering that at every point, things could have been different. And so I think that, Mantel does this beautifully. Her characters don't quite know what's coming. And she manages to kind of capture what it feels like to be in this moment where you don't yet know the outcome, because you're living through it. And I think as readers, we can kind of, be transported into the past and feel a little bit of that contingency of history, like what's going to happen. We don't really know because we're living through it. I hope that makes sense. So I want to look at some examples of this. So here's the first book in the trilogy, Wolf Hall, and that came out in 2009. By the way, both of these books won the Booker Prize in England for the best book of the year. This is the second one, called Bring Up the Bodies. The third one is not out yet, and I'll talk a little bit about it at the end today. But so far, there's just been the two books in what is projected to be a trilogy, the Wolf Hall trilogy, that she's written. So Cromwell, as I said, sort of doesn't know, as he's living these events, how things are going to turn out. He also knows that it's kind of a tumultuous time and that, any day could be his last. He knows that he has enemies. He says at one point that there are people who, if they could, would destroy him with one vindictive swipe, as if he were a fly. So he's very adept, this Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell, the character that she's developed, he's very adept at kind of negotiating his way in life. He's a pragmatist. So here's a passage, this is quote number 3, that kind of captures this sense of not knowing quite what's coming. So here's the passage, number 3. His inner voice mocks him now. You thought you were going to get a holiday at Wolf Hall. You thought there would be nothing to do here except the usual business, war and peace, famine, traitorous connivance, a failing harvest, a stubborn populace, plague ravishing London, and the king losing his shirt at cards. You were prepared for that. At the edge of his inner vision, behind his closed eyes, he senses something in the act of becoming. It will arrive with morning light, something shifting and breathing, its form disguised in a copse or grove. So do you see? I mean, that's the central consciousness. That's sort of getting inside his head. There's something coming. What is it? What else do you notice about that passage? Is there anything about that list of things that he has to do with, the usual business, that jumps out at you? Say that again? It sounds like today, except maybe the plague. Sure, failing harvest, stubborn populace, the plague. What about war and peace? What does that remind you of? Tolstoy. I think that's not incidental. I think that's on purpose. I think she's kind of paying homage there to previous historical novelists. One thing I've learned as a kind of literature professor is not to underestimate novelists. They usually know what they're doing. So I don't know. I tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think with that phrase, war and peace, I think she's sort of paying homage to Tolstoy. Okay, so it is true. Oh, by the way, here's the famous painting of Thomas Cromwell, her protagonist, by Holbein, Hans Holbein, the younger, who was the court painter for Henry VIII. And you guys have seen this image before, I'm sure. He did lots of paintings of Thomas More as well. And Hilary Mantel actually talks about this painting in the book, and has Hans Holbein as one of her characters as well. Okay, so the other thing that we may want to discuss briefly is that, historical novelists also have to be careful not to distort history, right? So there's this kind of expectation that there are expectations that they sort of have to follow, the history as it unfolds, right? So Hilary Mantel herself once said, if I were to distort something just to make it more convenient or more dramatic, I would feel that I've failed as a writer. If you understand what you're talking about, you should be drawing the drama out of real life, not putting it there like icing on the cake. And so I love that idea that she wants to be faithful to the historical period, but she also wants to dramatize it, to make it come alive, right? And so it's not like putting icing on the cake. It's like she wants to draw it out of the material that she's working with, okay? But I would just posit that she kind of has her cake and eats it too, because she sometimes does have these little flourishes that are like icing on the cake, okay? So here's a passage, the next passage I want to look at. This is quotation number 5. I think this gets at a little bit sort of what her approach is, okay? She says, the fate of peoples is made like this, 2 men in small rooms. Forget the coronations, the conclaves of cardinals, the pomp and processions. This is how the world changes. A counter pushed across a table, a pen stroke that alters the force of a phrase, a woman's sigh as she passes and leaves on the air a trail of orange flower or rose water, her hand pulling close the bed curtain, the discreet sigh of flesh against flesh. And so here in this passage, I think she's telling us what she's trying to do as a historical novelist, which is to peer behind closed doors, to pull back the curtains, if you will, on the way that her characters are living their lives. So it's hard to imagine, I think, a better statement of sort of her method. And I think one thing we can say is that one of the pleasures of historical fiction is this kind of voyeurism that we see into people's lives. So here's Hilary Mantel. And here's the quote that I just read. Sorry about that. I should have put that on the board. I hope people have it on the handout as well. So one of the great literary critics about historical fiction was a Russian critic named Georg Lukács. And here's Lukács here. He wrote a book called The Historical Novel, in which he argues that historical faithfulness is not achieved by sticking to the facts. But he says that rather, historical novelists must try to capture the authenticity of the characters, and particularly their inner lives and behavior, which is how we actually experience history. Another critic that I really admire, a more contemporary one, is James Wood, who writes for The New Yorker and teaches at Harvard. There he is, James Wood. He has an excellent book, by the way, called How Fiction Works, which I think is a really good kind of short primer on these kind of narrative issues. But this is what James Wood has to say about Mantel's literary method. So this is quote number 6. Where much historical fiction gets entangled in the simulation of historical authenticity, Mantel bypasses those knots of concoction and proceeds as if authenticity were magic rather than a science. She knows that what gives fiction its vitality is not the accurate detail, but the animate one, and that novelists are creators, not coroners. So I think he's on to something here. She's, in a sense, Mantel and other historical fiction writers are bringing people back to life, but they're not coroners. They have to kind of breathe life into these characters and make it look like, they're alive. So that's what matters. I mean, it's kind of what Lukács is saying, is that their inner lives, the way they experience history, and not so much the historical authenticity of it. And so what I would argue is that in addition to just the inner lives, one of the things that we're learning in Wolf Hall and in Bring Up the Bodies is the way the characters are thinking through theological issues as well. So I want to turn to that now and look at some of the things that Mantel has to teach us about the Protestant Reformation and about the kind of ideas that were circulating and changing during this period in England. So we're gonna kind of back up. When I talked earlier, I talked about Luther a little bit, and one of the things we have to remember about the context in England is that King Henry VIII took a pretty strong stand against Luther in the beginning. He actually wrote this treatise, this theological. King Henry VIII was very knowledgeable about the Bible, and he considered himself a little bit of a kind of lay theologian. So interestingly enough, so he wrote this treatise in Latin between 1519 and 1521 titled Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or Defense of the Seven Sacraments. In effect, Henry affirmed the basic tenets of the Roman Catholic Church, including the supremacy of the Pope. So not surprisingly, the Pope liked this. It was Pope Leo X at the time. And so on October 11th, 1521, Pope Leo X conferred on Henry VIII the title Fide Defensor, or Defender of the Faith. As we all know, so Henry VIII initially was sort of against what was happening on the continent. So we all recall that Henry VIII felt that he needed a son in order to secure the Tudor dynasty in England. And his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced but one living child, a daughter, Mary Tudor. So in 1533, after a marriage of 23 years, Henry divorced his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And in doing so, he broke with the Church of Rome because the Pope had refused to give him an annulment. And he proclaimed himself as the head of the Church of England, okay? So here's an image of Henry VIII from right around that time, 1520, this says, from the National Portrait Gallery in London. Here's a portrait of Catherine of Aragon, whom he has just divorced. And I think I showed this last time, but I just think it's fascinating that they've put the two portraits side by side in the National Portrait Gallery. So they're now in effect reunited, which I think is kind of wonderful. Here's an image of Lady Mary Tudor, later Queen Mary I from 1536. So this is their child. And then here's a later image of Catherine of Aragon, actually from the early 18th century, but it's also in the National Portrait Gallery. All right, so I've learned a lot from this historian, Dearmaid McCullough, also an Oxford Don, and not to be confused with our own David McCullough, the great American historian. Dearmaid McCullough wrote this book, The Reformation, A History. He also has a book on the history of Christianity, which I have not read, which sounds great. He's a friend of Hilary Mantel's, and so that's one of the reasons I bring him up tonight. He has this description of King Henry VIII that is interesting and that Hilary Mantel picks up on in the book. He says, he traces in the Reformation, A History, this book, what he calls a subtle shift in theological stance during Henry VIII's reign. And what he says is that the king's complex religious views began moving crabwise in an evangelical direction. So that metaphor of like a crab, I take it, is that Henry VIII is kind of, going forward, two steps forward and one step back, or is it the opposite? One step forward and two steps back. That Henry VIII is kind of, coming around to a more Protestant view of things, but he's taking his time about it, okay? So notice that Hilary Mantel picks up on this same metaphor in the second volume of the trilogy, Bring Up the Bodies. So here's the quote, and she's pulling this straight from McCullough, okay? He knows the king is devout and afraid of change. He wants the church reformed. He wants it pristine. He also wants money. But as a native of the sign of Cancer, he proceeds crabwise to his objective, a side shuffle, a weaving motion. Okay, so that's Henry VIII. And an example of one of the ways that he's doing this is with the Eucharist, the sacrament of the Eucharist. So you recall from my previous lecture that the Eucharist was a major source of division during the Protestant Reformation. In fact, Martin Luther, in his Confession Concerning Christ's Supper in 1530, he wrote this about the Last Supper. This is quotation number 9. If I were to say over all the bread there is, this is the body of Christ, nothing would happen. But when we follow his institution and command in the supper and say, this is my body, then it is his body. Not because of our speaking or our declarative word, but because of his command in which he has told us so to speak and to do, and has attached his own command and deed to our speaking. So ironically, given his earlier excoriation of Luther, Henry VIII more or less adopted this position, affirming Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. So even though Luther himself did not use the phrase real presence, this is how his position is often described on the Eucharist, that there was a real presence there. And so that's what the King Henry VIII, kind of landed on. He issued a royal proclamation in 1538, which here's Henry VIII in 1537, right around this time. He issued a royal proclamation in 1538, which states that the most blessed and holy sacrament of the altar is the very body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then in the subsequent Act of 6 Articles of 1539, he made real presence, in effect, a litmus test of allegiance to the crown. So everyone around him needed to believe in this real presence as well. So the first of the Act of 6 Articles reads as follows, and this is quotation number 10. First, that in the most blessed sacrament of the altar, by the strength and efficacy of Christ's mighty word, it being spoken by the priest, is present really under the form of bread and wine, the natural body and blood of our Savior Jesus Christ, conceived of the Virgin Mary, and that after the consecration there remaineth no substance of bread or wine, nor any other substance, but the substance of Christ, God and man. So this was a big deal, kind of announcing what is not transubstantiation, but is a more Protestant view, but still a fairly strongly sacramental one. Am I making sense? So that becomes the official English position, and of course, this didn't go far enough for the most radical of the Protestant reformers. But in any case, the historian Eamon Duffy, in his book, The Stripping of the Altars, he calls this a decisive turning point for the progress of Protestantism under Henry. Doubts were growing among Protestant reformers about real presence and transubstantiation alike, nonetheless. And so suddenly, with Henry kind of playing his hand, as it were, there was a severe risk of punishment or even death for running afoul of church doctrine. And here I want to talk a little bit about the martyrs of the Protestant Reformation. You recall our friend John Wycliffe, the first person to translate the New Testament into English, and he in 1381 had formulated his own doctrine of the Lord's Supper. He said, quote, "The bread, while becoming by virtue of Christ's words the body of Christ, does not cease to be bread." But I think what's interesting about Wycliffe is that after his death in 1384, they declared him a heretic and banned his writings in the Council of Constance. So the council ordered his remains to be removed from consecrated ground. And this order, confirmed by Pope Martin V, was carried out in 1428, well after his death in 1384. So while he's not the first martyr, he was in a sense like exhumed so that he could be martyred, and was something of a martyr. So his corpse was exhumed and burned, and his ashes were thrown into the river Swift. Wycliffe's death is one of many recounted in Acts and Monuments of these later and perilous days touching matters of the church, by John Foxe, published in English in 1563. This is more popularly known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs. And John Wycliffe is certainly one of them. Now, Wycliffe, of course, was very early, but Wycliffe's followers were known as the Lollards, and they were relentlessly persecuted. They they would go around saying that the consecrated host was merely a piece of bread. And Thomas More, for example, very much persecuted the Lollards, who were followers of Wycliffe. So Thomas More, interestingly enough, who had been something of a hero in the earlier movie about Thomas More by Robert Bolt, what was the play called? The Man for All Seasons. Thomas More was sort of a liberal hero, right? But in this book, and I think historically as well, I think he was a little bit more of a dogmatist, and searching out heretics and finding them and putting them to death. So Henry had decreed towards the end of his life in 1546 that anyone who denied the doctrine of real presence could be executed. And one of the martyrs that Becky Serling told us about was Anne Askew, and she was executed in 1546 in part over this issue with the Eucharist, all right? So here's Anne Askew's death as it is portrayed in the Fox's Book of Martyrs, the burning of Anne Askew. And then another martyr, of course, is Tyndale, William Tyndale, who was tried for heresy and executed in October 1536, actually 10 years before Anne Askew, while he was living in exile in Antwerp. Tyndale's New Testament, which was first published in Germany in 1526, was banned in England, but within 2 years of Tyndale's martyrdom, here's Tyndale, portrait of him, and then the image in Acts and Monuments of Tyndale's execution. Within 2 years of Tyndale's martyrdom, at Cromwell's urging, Henry VIII reconsidered his earlier prohibition against Bibles written in the vernacular, and Mantel describes Thomas Cromwell's influence on him like this. It is his daily covert crusade for Henry to sponsor a great Bible, put it in every church. He is very close now, and he thinks he can win Henry to it. So it's true that Cromwell was influential there. In fact, Cromwell had also interceded on behalf of Tyndale and tried to get Henry not to pursue this, trying to have Tyndale killed. So in that case, too, he was a more kind of liberal influence. But sure enough, Henry VIII commissioned the Great Bible 2 years later. It was published in 1539 this actually is Tyndale's New Testament, sorry, so that's from 1526. And then here's Henry VIII from 1540. And then this is the title page of the Great Bible from 1539. And the frontispiece is traditionally ascribed to Hans Holbein the Younger. And ironically, the Great Bible followed Tyndale's translation quite closely for the most part, with some additional translation from Miles Coverdale. I think I showed you this image before, which I think is remarkable. It's in the British Library, and it's considered to be the copy, Henry VIII's own copy of the Great Bible. So this was the Bible authorized by the king himself. All right, so as I mentioned, in Hilary Mantel's novels at least, Thomas Cromwell comes across as the one who's more open to new ideas, while Thomas More is the one who comes across as dogmatic and intransigent. So here's a passage, quote number 11. We're going to watch a clip here pretty soon where a lot of this is going to come together. But this is a passage in which Cromwell is kind of thinking about this contrast with his adversary, Thomas More. And he says, "Why does everything you know and everything you've learned confirm you in what you believed before? Whereas in my case, what I grew up with and what I thought I believed is chipped away a little and a little, a fragment, then a piece, and then a piece more. And with every month that passes, the corners are knocked off the certainties of this world and the next world too. Show me where it says in the Bible, purgatory. Show me where it says relics, monks, nuns. Show me where it says Pope. So we see here how religious verities of his time are suddenly thrown into question. And in another passage, Cromwell explains it like this: as the word of God spreads, the people's eyes are opened to new truths. They have seen their religion painted on the walls of churches or carved in stone, but now God's pen is poised, and he is ready to write his words in the books of their hearts. So the metaphor of God writing on the heart, I think, conveys some of the intense introspection of evangelical sensibilities. In another passage, Cromwell is kind of starting to question this notion of purgatory, which he has assumed for a long time to be sort of beyond question. This is quote number 12. Imagine the silence now in that place which is no place, that anteroom to God where each hour is 10,000 years long. Once you imagined the souls held in a great net, a web spun by God, held safe till their release into his radiance. But if the net is cut and the web broken, do they spill into freezing space, each year falling further into silence until there is no trace of them at all? So I would call this a kind of very subtle portrait of Cromwell's mind in motion. He's kind of trying to think through the implications of these new ideas. And I'll cite one other example. I mentioned earlier that Hans Holbein the Younger, here you see a self-portrait by Hans Holbein from 1542. He's one of the characters in the novel, which is amazing. And he's painting the portrait of Cromwell. And in fact, you remember the portrait of Cromwell that I showed earlier by Holbein. There's a joke in the novel where he finally sees his own portrait and he says, well, geez, I look like a murderer. And his son Gregory says, didn't you know? And so the joke is like, yeah, you do kind of look like a murderer, right? So anyway, back to Holbein, I think in this passage that's quote number 13, Holbein kind of gives voice to this vertiginous quality of living through the Protestant Reformation, of sort of what is going on, right? Everything, the ground is shifting beneath our feet. And of course, remember that Holbein has come to England from the continent, where he's been sort of in the midst of it. And so this passage, number 13, it says, Hans grunts, downs his cup of wine, and talks about what he's left behind. Talk about Bosley, about the Swiss cantons and cities, riots and pitched battles, images not images, statues not statues. It is the body of God, it is not the body of God. It is sort of the body of God. Priests may marry, they may not. There are 7 sacraments, there are 3. The crucifix we creep to on our knees and reverence with our lips, or the crucifix we chop it up and burn it in the public square. So here's, Hans Holbein, sort of exasperated with the way that these religious controversies are kind of wreaking havoc all over Europe. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the way that Mantel captures her characters questioning and probing the theological issues of the day, and in effect kind of capturing this inner experience of the Protestant Reformation. So what I want to do now is show a film clip from the British TV series Wolf Hall, and I'm sure some of you have seen it. So Brandon, I think, is going to switch us over so that we can hear sound, but hold on just a minute, Brandon. So this scene, I hope, is going to help convey some of the ideas we've been covering so far. Watch for the particularly ardent Protestant reformer in the middle scene, who turns out to be none other than Thomas Cranmer, the future Archbishop of Canterbury, and I'll talk about him a little bit after the break. The relationship between Thomas Cromwell and his wife Liz is featured here, and I think it's one of the most wonderful things about the novel, and I think a little bit of a nod to Becky here for just the experience of women in the Protestant Reformation, and what a great influence they had on the men too. Some of you have watched the series, so you know how great Mark Rylance's performance is as Thomas Cromwell. And it might be helpful to know that just prior to this scene, Thomas Cromwell has had a conversation with his beloved wife, Liz, about a pirated edition of Tyndale's Bible that he's received in the mail from Antwerp. Quote, "It's in English, read it for yourself. That's the point, Lizzie. You read it. You'll be surprised what's not in it." So recall too that Cromwell had argued on Tyndale's behalf, trying to persuade King Henry VIII not to worry about pursuing him across the English Channel. So I think that's just a little bit of kind of what to watch for, but then I want to talk about this scene after we watch it with you, and we'll kind of talk about what we learn. How are we doing, Brandon?
Ready to go.
We're ready to go? Okay. Okay, that's so that's the scene. Quite an affecting scene of his wife's death of the sweating sickness or the plague. So any thoughts in watching that? What do we see about Cromwell here? Does it kind of get us into his experience of his life? I think we obviously see a very intimate, tragic moment there of coming back home after being away all day and finding that his wife has died. And do you remember at the beginning of the scene where he's leaving and she's lying in bed and she seems slightly delirious because she says, "Tell me when you're going," and he says, I'm not going. Remember, I told you I'm not going to France with Wolsey. But then you remember when he's coming down the stairs and he says, "Go back to bed, Liz," and he looks up and it's as if she was there but not there. I don't know what that's interesting, isn't it? Almost like a bad omen. What's that? Yeah, definitely a foreshadowing. We kind of see what's going on there. But what about the meeting? When he first arrives at the place where that clandestine meeting is going on, behind closed doors, as it were, right? What does he tell the porter as he's entering? "If anyone asks for me, I'm not here." If anyone asks for me, I'm not here, right? He doesn't want to be found out attending this meeting. But at the meeting, they're basically describing, their desire for reform and their doubts about some of the things that Luther is questioning as well, right? Yes, please.
It's interesting that you could see there was truly fear.
Yes.
And then the day he found out, they were questioning things.
Definitely. And of course, they're also discussing, how big is the risk? Thomas Cranmer is with Wolsey, right? But of course, Wolsey is on the outs with the king, and so Thomas More is most likely to become, the king's Lord Chancellor. So Cromwell here says it's going to be worse with Thomas More. He's going to burn men, not Bibles. Yes.
It was interesting to hear his list, his liturgy of things that he had to subtract.
That's right.
From the Bible.
Yes.
That were thought to be
Yes.
biblical.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. So you bring up that it's reading the Bible for themselves that is kind of raising some of these issues.
Lowers the bar.
Yeah. Interesting.
Mark,
Yes, Tom.
should we be concerned? Should it be a concern?
Yeah.
We can't tell in what's shown, which details are based on historical research and good scholarship.
Good point.
Scholarship, or which details
Yes.
are the author's creative
Yes.
idea bringing something to life and not really.
Well, you bring up an excellent point, Tom, because who knows if this, if this exact conversation happened, So that's the question I'm trying to ask. Like, so is it historically authentic, even if it didn't happen, in the sense that it's, something like this probably did happen, but of course she has to sort of invent some of these types of meetings, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, that's the question.
Yeah.
You have to trust that she's interpreting
Yeah.
historical events accurately enough.
Yeah.
That interpretation, though the conversation may never have happened, of course, it's an invention. It still reflects what actually happened. So it's a real question about what is actual.
Yeah.
And whether the interpretation presentation gets you back into what was actually there.
And if I might follow on, with a historical, with a history,
Yes.
then one might disagree
Yeah.
with the writer's interpretation.
Yeah.
But you have a pretty good chance of knowing what's interpretation, what isn't. Here, you
Ah,
don't have too much
yeah.
chance to know
Yeah.
what's interpretation and what is not.
Yeah, you have a point there. I mean, I was going to say that she is going to be completely accurate about sort of where Cromwell is and where Wolsey is and where he was moved around. I mean, to the extent that she does know the details, she's going to follow those, right? But then remember what I said about she's going to also try to peer behind closed doors. She's going to try to imagine herself into those rooms, including the room where Liz dies, and Cromwell is, kind of processing that death, right? So those are the scenes that I think fiction is trying to bring alive. You had a thought in the middle there, yeah.
My question is going back to the quote about nuns and popes and,
Yeah, yeah,
the whole,
yeah,
how many people of the average, we hear what all the scholars are saying
Sure.
at the time, but how, if you ask somebody in the populace,
yeah,
is the office of the pope defined in the Bible, or
yeah,
is the office of a monk or a nun
sure,
defined in the Bible? Is any of this monasticism in general defined in the Bible? And so the answers are, we read it now and obviously say, well, no,
Sure.
that stuff isn't good.
yeah.
Does the average person know that or even care?
Well, no, that's a good question. I mean, I would say the majority of the population is illiterate, first of all. But yeah, I think you raise a good point. Yeah, I mean,
Bible written in English yet for the general public?
so at this point, Tyndale is the one that would have been available. Interestingly enough, Tyndale's Bible, even though it was banned, was fairly popular. So people did want to read it. And of course, I mentioned that eventually, Henry VIII kind of changes course correction, if you will, and decides, okay, we're going to have the Bible in English available for everyone. But yeah, no, you raise a good point. And I think another answer I would offer to your question is that a lot of scholars these days are realizing, look, something like the Protestant Reformation doesn't just happen overnight. Plenty of people in the parishes, in the countryside, they're going to want to continue worshiping the same way they always have. They're going to kind of retain the same beliefs that they've had, right? And they're going to hold on to those, right? So, a good way of thinking about this might be that, the kind of dominant view on some of these things is going to be pretty tenacious. And even as newer ideas are emerging and people are trying to grasp those. So that's one of the things that I'm arguing historical fiction can offer, is this kind of portrait of change that's as it's happening, how people are trying to, take these new ideas and sort of think through them and think through what are the implications for what I used to think, was the case. So absolutely, it's a kind of process of historical change and of mental changes that people are undergoing. Yes?
And there was a moment of optimism there
Yeah.
guy says, I'll go to Rome, and I'm sure I can convince the Pope that
Yeah, true. That sounds like a pretty hopeless task, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, please.
Question, how much of the first 5 books of the Bible is historical fiction?
Yeah.
We know
Yeah.
a fair amount about it.
Sure. I don't have a good answer for that one. But yeah. Yes, please.
In the 2 portraits of Moore and Cromwell,
Yes.
they each hold a piece of paper in their hand.
That's true. Yeah.
Significance of that. I mean, none of the other portraits have this piece of paper.
That's true. So in the case of Moore, it's probably the Bible. In the case of Cromwell, it's probably,
It's a white piece of
is it a white piece of paper? Yeah. Yeah.
Could it be the
I think it's meant to signal their fairly official roles in the government, I think.
something from King Henry, not from Henry VIII, that this is the power they have?
This is the power that they have in the, yeah. I mean, remember that those 2 paintings of Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, which are both by Holbein, they hang side by side in the Frick Museum in New York on the same wall, kind of looking at each other, as it were, which is amazing. Tom?
Mark, I was struck by the joy and delight they
Yeah.
experienced in their first reading of the Bible.
Yes.
And it makes me wonder about my own reading
Yes.
of the Bible, even as a pastor,
Yes.
after 70 plus years.
Yes.
Contrast that not only with their reading then,
Yeah.
but the first reading of the Bible of people today in
Yeah.
several countries who are getting the Bible for the first time.
Absolutely. We know.
It convicts me really. Where is that first joy, the first love, the
Good
first
point.
delight?
Because we know the power that it can have, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
I think playing off of that.
Yeah.
I have the feeling that the people in the streets were intensely interested in these issues.
Yeah.
In part because of the beginnings of the reading of, in their own language, in the vernacular. This was, and what happened is the whole thing exploded.
Yeah.
With
So,
enormous energy, and it
Yeah.
would not have if people were not questioning these things and thinking.
Absolutely.
through.
Yeah.
If you pronounce such profound challenge to the authority of the way the whole world is determined, shaped
yeah.
for centuries, and the profound challenge of that authority, boy, people got interested.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a hurry.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And we really do see that character really saying, like, I'm drunk with the scriptures, right? It's having this amazing effect on me. Yeah.
Is the distortion inevitable and necessary? Every artist in the 1500s that was painting Christian
Yeah.
from the first century put it in a Roman or a Greek or Italian setting.
Yeah.
The characters were Italians with blonde hair and blue eyes. They had to do that so they could relate to it. They couldn't relate to Jesus as Jewish.
I
because
see.
Anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
They couldn't really get into it.
Interesting.
Person's eyes and understand what the Jewish person's feeling in the first century because they don't know the culture or the time
Yeah.
of the first century in 1500 when they're painting these paintings. They can read the words, but do they understand the climate?
Oh,
the culture,
interesting.
What the communication,
Sure.
the inner communication you're talking about do they understand what the inner is being communicated, what the real drama's about?
Yeah. Interesting. So you think reading the Bible in English, though, is going to kind of help bridge that gap to the first century? No. Yeah.
I think it has to be.
Yeah.
We understand it through 15th century culture and mind.
Sure.
We understand
Yeah.
Scripture through a 21st century culture and mind, sort of.
Yeah.
We'd have a lot more help archaeologically and
Yeah.
all the books we have
Yeah.
that tell us what it was like back then.
Sure.
So we can get more into
Well,
it.
it's certain.
But we didn't have it 50, 60 years ago. We
Yeah.
took it literal,
Sure.
factual, fundamental.
No, absolutely.
The promise says this, so it must be that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of my colleagues at APU, William Yarkin, has written about the history of biblical interpretation, and he shows how it kind of evolves and changes the way people read the Bible. So yeah, absolutely. Another thing I wanted to just throw out there about this scene, and one of the things I like about this Wolf Hall miniseries, it's almost all natural light. They're not, it doesn't look like, you know, most movies that we're accustomed to and being really lit, and you know, he's using like natural light and candlelight, which is kind of, you know, historically germane to the period. You know, a lot of dark scenes on interiors because of course they didn't have electricity, didn't have electric light. So I was going to take a short break at this point. I don't know how you guys feel. Maybe we should continue on. If you're up for it, I want to give my dad enough time to kind of wrap things up at the end. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to switch gears now, and I'm going to, well, actually, would you guys like just a short break, 5 minutes? Let's do that. No, yes. I think everybody would like to stretch, maybe get something to drink. We'll come back in 5 minutes, and I'll start. So I want to actually look at a historical document, a letter written by a jailer in the Tower of London. And then we'll look at what Hilary Mantel does with it. So this is kind of a little experiment with, if you will, a sort of workshop on how to do things with historical documents. So this is my second of the two handouts. And so first, I want to just have us look at the letter, okay? So this was written the day before Anne Boleyn. Here's Anne Boleyn in a painting after Holbein. She's Henry VIII's second wife, of course. So the day before she was to be executed on May 19th, 1536, William Kingston, Constable of the Tower of London, wrote the following letter to Thomas Cromwell. And so here it is. It's the first quote on my second handout. "This morning she sent for me, that I might be with her at such time as she received the good Lord, to the intent I should hear her speaking as touching her innocency, always to be clear. And in the writing of this she sent for me, and at my coming she said, 'Mr. Kingston, I hear I shall not die afore noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time and past my pain.' I told her it should be no pain, it was so little. And then she said, 'I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck,' and then put her hands about it, laughing heartily. I have seen many men and also women executed, and that they have been in great sorrow, and to my knowledge this lady has much joy in death. Sir, her almoner is continually with her, and had been since 2 o'clock after midnight." So it's a pretty remarkable letter, and it shows that Anne Boleyn was able to make jokes about her death.
You accidentally switched it.
I accidentally switched the, yeah, there we go, good. So I want to kind of move quickly to what does Mantel do with this? It's a historical document that she has to go on. Obviously, she's going to want to represent this juicy detail about what Anne Boleyn does. So how does she do it? She actually uses the letter in two different scenes, and she reworks it as follows. So in the first scene, this is from they're both from Bring Up the Bodies, the second book in the trilogy. So in the first scene, Cromwell himself visits Anne Boleyn in her cell. And so this is the first scene, the first passage. "He feels himself on the edge of something unwelcome, superfluous knowledge, useless information. He turns, hesitates, reaches out, tentative. But then she raises her hands and clasps them at her breast, in the gesture Lady Rochfort had showed him. Ah, Queen Esther, he thinks, she is not innocent. She can only mimic innocence. His hand drops to his side. He turns away. He knows her for a woman without remorse. He believes she would commit any sin or crime. He believes she is her father's daughter, that never since childhood has she taken any action, coaxed or coerced, that might damage her own interests. But in one gesture, she has damaged them now. She has seen his face change. She steps back, puts her hands around her throat. Like a strangler, she closes them around her own flesh. I have only a little neck, she says. It will be the work of the moment. Kingston hurries out to meet him. He wants to talk. She keeps doing that, her hands around her neck and laughing. His honest jailer's face is dismayed. I cannot see that is any occasion for laughter. So that's the first scene that she reworks, and she changes some things about the historical source, doesn't she? In the historical document, Cromwell is not there. It's Kingston, the jailer, the constable, who reports it to him in a letter. But I think, in a way, she kind of covers herself a little bit by having Kingston, in her scene, come out and says, oh, she keeps doing that. She puts her hands around her neck and laughs, and I can't see it as any occasion for laughter. So the implication is that she's done it more than once, and that maybe she could have done it in Cromwell's presence as well. But in any case, it does dramatize the scene, does it not, to have her protagonist, Cromwell, actually witness it, right? So it is, I think, a kind of dramatization of the scene in question. It lends it greater immediacy to have Cromwell in the room, as opposed to learning about it from the constable or through a letter. Do you see what I mean? Okay, so the second scene, though, he also uses this same letter and kind of reworks it. And in this scene, Cromwell laments the fact that Anne Boleyn has apparently gotten the date of her execution mixed up, that she thinks she should be dead by now, and she somehow can't believe that she's still alive. So in this second scene, which is further on in the book, page 392, it says this: Anne, he is sorry to learn, and the he here is always Cromwell. Remember I said that there's the narrator, it's a third person narration, but it's always through Cromwell's perspective, or even inside Cromwell's head, right? So Anne, he is sorry to learn, has mistaken the day of her death, rising at 2 a.m. to pray on the morning of May 18th, sending for her almoner and for Cranmer to come to her at dawn so she can purge herself of her sins. No one seems to have told her that Kingston comes without fail at dawn on the morning of an execution to warn the dying person to be ready. She is not familiar with the protocol, and why should she be? Kingston says, see it from my point of view, 5 deaths in one day and to be ready for a Queen of England the next day. So he's putting it off till the next day after that, which is May 19th. Still, the constable is sorry for her misapprehension, especially since her mistake ran on late into the morning. The situation is a great strain on both himself and his wife. Instead of being glad of another dawn, he reports, Anne had cried, and she said she was sorry not to die that day. She wishes she were past her pain. She knew about the friend executioner, and I told her, Kingston says, it shall be no pain. It is so subtle. But once again, Kingston says, she closed her fingers around her throat. She had taken the Eucharist, declaring on the body of God her innocence, which surely she would not do, Kingston says, if she were guilty. She laments the men who are gone. She makes jokes, saying that she will be known hereafter as Anne the Headless, Anne sans tête. So here's another place where she kind of works some of the details from that letter, from that historical document, into her own fiction, right? But again, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar. So the starting point here is Anne Boleyn's confusion about the date of her execution, which is derived from the letter. And in fact, she was executed the following day. So Mantel is kind of describing the guilt that the jailer might have felt from such a mistake. So note too that Anne Boleyn is insisting upon her innocence here. The charges against her were pretty severe, not only treason, but also adultery and incest with her own brother. So she was denying those charges. It's clear that it's pretty important to Cromwell that she's lying a little bit. And both of them are wondering, why would she take communion if she were guilty, right? That's a question that is raised for both of them. So my point is that the scene is kind of drawing the drama out of real life, but it's sort of adding these layers of psychological complexity, okay? And she's taking liberty with the source, yes, but it's not really jeopardizing historical authenticity. If anything, I think Mantel is getting a little closer to how these individuals were experiencing what is, after all, a pretty traumatic event, right? I would say that this last little bit, Anne the Headless, or Anne sans tête, that seems to be the icing on the cake to me, because I don't remember that from the letter, right? I think that's a kind of a little flourish that Mantel is adding to show that Anne Boleyn, still has a kind of sense of humor about it. So I want to show one more clip. I hope that's okay. And then I'll kind of bring it to a close. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the martyrs that come under Mary. So that's how we'll finish. But this clip is about the same length, about 4 minutes long, and it's a remarkable clip. Some of you guys will recognize Anne Boleyn is played by Claire Foy, the British actress, who also went on to portray a young Queen Elizabeth II in The Crown, the Netflix series that my wife Victoria and I watched the whole thing. So Claire Foy plays Anne Boleyn here, and she's amazing. Okay, excellent. Thanks, Brandon. So, yeah, that's the same scene that we just looked at on paper. What do you guys think? I sort of like Mantel's version a little bit better. I don't think this scene quite manages to capture the fact that Anne Boleyn has a sense of humor about it. She's much more frightened and cornered, but still insisting on her innocence, right? What else about the scene was I going to mention? Do you have anyone have any thoughts? Does Cromwell think that she's guilty? It appears not. It appears that he has some real doubts. When she says the line, "You have no witnesses," he thinks for a minute, and of course he's a lawyer. And I think he's trying to process the fact that it is a trumped up case against her, People are bringing forth these charges under duress, if not torture. So this is Anne's execution is what ends the second volume of the trilogy, Bring Up the Bodies. And of course, there's a third trilogy, a third volume in the trilogy coming that's going to chronicle after Anne Boleyn's execution and sort of what happens next. Hilary Mantel was here at the Huntington Library in May at a conference on historical fiction. And I was one of the speakers at this conference. So she gave a keynote lecture the night before. And I wanted to read a couple of passages from that lecture that I think will resonate with what we've been talking about. So the lecture was titled, "I Met a Man Who Wasn't There." And here's Hilary Mantel on the differences between history and historical fiction. When a historian writes, for example, about the execution of Anne Boleyn, the head falls and a chapter closes, new page, new chapter. But human experience isn't like that. Those who are still alive wake up next day, confused, frightened. There has been a wave of arrests, but are they over? Is Anne's execution the end of something or the beginning of something? We know they didn't. By trying to reimagine the continuity of human experience, rather than draw a line and turn a page, I have, I hope, been able to cast some light back on the last weeks of the life of Anne and her circle. I haven't made any discoveries. I'm just writing it differently because I'm writing it humanly. So what exactly does fiction bring to our understanding of history? According to the author herself, quote, what we are presenting is the inner experience of our subjects. We know that inner experience exists, however hard to access. We access it through our familiarity with the age we are writing about, something which is not quickly achieved. As novelists, we're not repudiating subjectivity, we're seeking it. It's what we bring to this table, subjectivity. Good historical fiction is self-conscious, like a painting where the brushstrokes are visible. So that's basically been my point about her fiction, is that she's trying to kind of bring us into the inner lives of these characters so that we kind of get a glimpse of what it was like to live during the Protestant Reformation. So I think what I'll do now, in order to leave a little bit of time to my dad to kind of wrap things up, is I want to kind of take us forward after Anne Boleyn's execution, and we'll talk about some of the turmoil, really, that happened in later, okay? So there's the scene we just watched. I'm going to skip a couple of these, and we're going to go to... Oh, this is an image of Hilary Mantel in an illustration that's after Holbein that was in the New Yorker in 2012, which is wonderful. Note the resemblance to Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's next wife. Seymour was mentioned in the film clip we just watched. Anne Boleyn said, Seymour is certainly emboldened, right? Because Seymour, after Anne Boleyn's death, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, his third wife, and she died, however, 12 days after giving birth to Henry's first legitimate son and heir, Edward. There's Prince Edward from 1538. It was widely known, by the way, that Henry had an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, with his mistress Elizabeth Blount. And then in a span of 7 years from 1540 until his death in 1547, Henry VIII married 3 more times. There's another one of Edward. Oh, that's after Holbein. That's Edward VI, so when he came to the throne. But before that happened, Henry VIII married 3 more times. Cromwell's downfall, as you know, came in part because he had urged Henry VIII to marry Anne of Cleves, and his behavior was becoming increasingly kind of erratic. So when Edward VI ascended the throne, the English Reformation kind of gained momentum. The Act of 6 Articles that I mentioned before were repealed in 1547, and then Archbishop Thomas Cranmer adopted a more reformist position on the Eucharist as the official Anglican position. And you remember our historian, Dearmaid McCullough? Here's how he describes this development. Quote, around the time of the old king's death, Archbishop Cranmer became convinced that Luther was wrong in affirming Eucharistic real presence. One might cynically call this a convenient moment to change his convictions, but we should never underestimate the psychological effect of suddenly being released from the hypnotic power of Henry's extraordinary personality. So in any case, Cranmer modified the liturgy accordingly in the English church, And he was the one who spearheaded two prayer books in English that were published in 1549 and 1552. The Book of Common Prayer did not go far enough to appease some of the most radical reformers in repudiating real presence. But Cranmer defended his position in 1551 by saying, "I do as plainly speak as I can that Christ's body and blood be given to us indeed, yet not corporally and carnally, but spiritually and effectually." So I think he's taking a more kind of spiritual or symbolic approach to it. But of course, so even though the Protestant Reformation kind of had wings under Edward, that was not to last, of course, because Edward died at a very young age in 1553, and the throne then passed to Henry VIII's eldest daughter, Mary. Here's Lady Mary Tudor. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop, tried to divert the succession from Mary to Jane Grey, a Protestant member of the royal family. But that scheme didn't go anywhere, and Mary became queen. Having been raised a Catholic by her mother, Catherine, Mary assiduously persecuted those who refused to accept the Catholic faith. And among the most prominent reformers to face persecution under Mary's reign were the Oxford Martyrs. So I'll talk about them here for a minute. So here are the relevant illustrations. First, the Anglican bishops Hugh Latimer and John Ridley, and then Archbishop Cranmer himself were executed. So this is Latimer and Ridley, who were burned at the stake in Oxford on October 16th, 1555. And then Cranmer's death came later on March 21st, 1556. This is where it happened in Oxford, right on Broad Street, just outside Balliol College. So this is the Oxford Martyrs' Cross, which marks the spot where the three of them, the Oxford Martyrs, were burned at the stake. And they've put up a memorial to the Oxford Martyrs as well. This is on St. Giles Street in Oxford. My wife Victoria and I lived there for a year, so we got to know the city pretty well. We lived, up the street on Banbury. This is a photograph I took, for example, on the other side of Broad Street. You see the Sheldonian Theater there on Broad Street. And then this is a memorial I found on the internet, a Reformation memorial to the martyrs. Not just the three Oxford martyrs, but all those who lost their lives during the Reformation in Oxford, in and around Oxford. And so this was put up in University Church of St. Mary, which looks like that, on Radcliffe Square in Oxford. Great. So that sort of brings my presentation to a close. I was going to talk a little bit about how Elizabeth I came to power and ruled for a very long time. And of course, she reestablished Protestantism. But that's, towards the end of her reign is when some of the Puritans decided that they weren't going to be able to reform the Church of England from within. And so they became what was called separatists. And they also were sometimes called pilgrims. They moved to Holland, the Netherlands first, and they considered that a pilgrimage, so they were called pilgrims. Puritans was actually a pejorative term that was applied to them from outside, but it kind of stuck. They were trying to purify the church, but they decided to separate. And it was, in the reign of James I, where they finally decided to go to America, first in 1620 to the Plymouth colony, and then 1630 to the Massachusetts Bay colony, now Boston. And so that's a whole nother story, though, which I hope we can pick up possibly in the spring and sort of follow this Protestant Reformation all the way to America in the early colonial period, but then also on into the future. So thanks a lot for having me tonight. Dad's going to come up and talk to us about where we've been.
Thank you. Well, I don't have a whole lot more to say. What a fascinating presentation. Just love it. This young man, took classes from me. Huh? Am I proud or what? I mean, it's just a delight. I wanted to mention, by the way, that he talked about Hilary Mantel speaking at the Huntington. He gave a presentation among all of these Brits, all these scholars who had come from England, and he was on this panel with them, and he gives a big presentation. Hilary Mantel was in the audience when he was speaking, so I think that's very cool, and I love it, Mark. Just absolutely delightful. We will all look forward to the next volume. And in case you haven't read the first two, I would encourage you. I think, I have had people tell me these are a little hard going. I mean, they're a little demanding as novels, and yet stay with it, because once you get into the rhythms and the style and so forth, it really, as Mark has demonstrated, it really begins to open up. And then, of course, the BBC series. So all very fascinating. Well, I would like to just close by saying thank you again to each of you and to all of you for staying with us, for being curious people, for being learners, for coming out on Sunday afternoon, of all things, 2-hour sessions, and here you are, and 1 week after another. So thank you very, very much, and thank you, as Mark said earlier, for the opportunity to be able to do this. I've said a number of times through my presentations and talking with people, I've had a chance through this opportunity to read a great deal, to reread a great deal, but read a great deal, and to reflect on this unbelievable period in history, as we have seen, complex, sprawling, all over the place. You talk about the causes of all of this, and you talk about the consequences of all of it, and all of it is very wonderfully intriguing, fascinating, endlessly fascinating. Don't you think? I mean, really quite a period in history, a period that preceded, of course, Luther and all that exploded out of that particular moment, but also a period that continues to impact our lives and world history and American society and our lives in this church even to this day. Things are not staying the way they have always been. History changes, things change. Our own historical moment, I think we are struggling and thinking through our own moment of possible reformation. Perhaps there is an understanding among us all that an ecumenical spirit is something we need at this moment in time to come together certainly across the gap between Catholics and Protestants, but Protestants among Protestants. All of the splintering that has happened and taken place, we need to think through. Do we need a renewal in the church? And I think that's my conviction, that we definitely do need a renewal in the Church of Jesus Christ. What we face is not battles now among ourselves. It seems to me we face a pervasively secular culture that would just as soon marginalize and push us as Christians to the side. We need to have our voice and our way of understanding our faith, just as the Reformers did in their moment, just as they were grappling with these issues. I tell you, you can't read any of these Reformers without knowing that these issues were real to them. I mean, they were grappling with things intensely, deeply. These were deeply important spiritual issues for them. It became historical. It became the national, all of the struggles between the national forces at work. It became all of that, of course, and it became a lot of things totally unintended by the Luthers and the Calvins who were writing. But you read them and you know that they are intensely dealing with deep spiritual issues. And those are the things that I think we need to focus on, try to understand. We talked about grace last week, and in my opinion, at the heart of the whole Reformation is the notion of grace, that in fact we can come into the presence of God without having to earn our way, that God accepts us into his presence. And we heard a beautiful sermon this morning from Tom on just this very topic. This is the heart of the matter. This is what we have to offer the world, is the love and grace of God as a gift to each one of us. So, hey, thank you all for being here, for coming. God bless you. Hey, we got a lot more reading and a lot more talking to do, of course, as we go ahead, and we'll see what unfolds on into the spring. But keep reading. I could not believe how many fabulous things sprung out of the internet last week and the week before, the week of the actual 500th year. Just amazing. People are reflecting on this thing. It's a big deal. Of course, it's a big deal among Christians mostly, but it's a big deal even because such a momentous time in history and an impact on everybody's lives. So keep reading. There's a whole lot to do out there. So God bless you. God bless each one of you. And we'll look forward to continuing conversation.